So we've talked a little bit about uploading files already, but I wanted to review on a few things, as well as go deeper on a few things that we didn't discuss yet. So, one thing that often comes up as we're working with file uploads is sometimes we need to deal with something called a MIME type, and a MIME type is used to distinguish what kind of file you're working with. And it's actually oftentimes used in the web in place of the extension, and because there's a lot of issues that happen with extensions where they might not be right, or it might not have, your file might not have an extension, yada yada yada. So in fact, every time we go to open up a link in the browser, go to a page in the browser, what the server sends us is always going to be two things over HTTPS. It's going to send us the MIME type of the file that it's giving us, as well as actually the data of the file. So anytime we go download a HTML page, we're getting this type text HTML, which tells us that the content of that is actually HTML, okay, or text CSS or text plain, etc. So that's telling us what kind of file we have. Now, we may use that as well uploading. We'll look at that in a minute, because when we look at how to set up the HTML for this, there's one place that can come up as well. So this is one thing we want to talk about first. So a media type, also known as a multi-purpose internet mail extensions type. That's the long form of this, what this acronym stands for. And you'll notice in there, multi-purpose internet mail extensions. Notice that there's an important word, mail, there, which might, if you know anything about MIME types, might seem a little bit out of place. Okay. Anybody have an idea as why that word's even in there?
Was it originally created for file attachments and emails?
Exactly. Yeah. So that's where this came up. So originally these MIME types were defined for email, specifically the SMTP protocol. So they're defined for mail as to, hey, I want to attach this PDF file or this Word doc or whatever it may be. I want to attach this image to my email. Well, I need to know when I get that email, what kind of file is it? Because I can't necessarily count on your file name extension meaning the same thing as my file name extension is. Because back then there were a lot of different programs running out there, and different programs sometimes use the same extension even though they were different files. Does that make sense? So you might have a file with this .dat extension and another file with this .dxt extension, but they're actually different files. They actually contain different things in it, so you need to use a different program to open it. So that's really the intent is to tell you which program you need to use to open it. Make sense? Okay. So this has kind of been standardized. There's RFC you can kind of look at. There's now a standards body that actually deals with this, called IANA. They actually hold all the standards of this MIME type is this file, and you can go read about all of them. There's the link to their, well, there's the Mozilla page, which has more info about MIME types, but in a minute I'll show you the link to their official list. Okay, so the general structure of a MIME type starts with the broad scale type of file it is, and a slash, and then what's called the subtype. Okay, so the first part of this might be something like audio or image or video. Tells you what kind of file it is. But if it's saying image, well, does that tell us specifically what kind of file it is or what program to open it as? Not quite enough. So what we'll see here is maybe image/PNG, image/JPEG, things like that tell us what specific kind of file is it. Okay. Similar thing where you'll see different types with audio files and video files and text files, etc. So that's the basic kind of layout of a MIME type. Questions on that so far? General type / subtype. Okay. So common broad scale types are here. We've got text, which is anything pretty much you can open up in a text editor. If it starts with text, then you can be sure it's going to open in Notepad++, or VS Code, or Visual Studio is going to be able to open it because it's just a text file of some sort. Images, obviously you'll need an image editor or image viewer for that. Audio files, video files, font files. And then there's this big category here at the end called application. Okay, application is kind of everything else. So application is you need a specific kind of application typically to read it. Okay, so common ones that we'll see, text / plain is just anything that's a plain text file. Think of a .txt file. Okay, HTML would be ends in .htm. .html is typically the extensions we would see there. Text HTML. Text XML, as you can kind of see. Images, you can see image / JPEG, image / PNG. For audio, you might see audio / MPEG. Notice it's not audio / MP3, but that's how you get MP3s. They're audio / MPEG. Video / MP4, and then other ones down here which we're actually more interested in. Both of these land into the application space. So application / PDF, right? That's what you see for a PDF file. Or application / JSON, which is kind of surprising because if you know anything about JSON, JSON is usually stored in what kind of file? What is it typically?
What is text?
It's really just text. So you would kind of expect this to be text JSON, but it is actually application JSON, is the official MIME type for JSON per INA. You can look at, there's a view reference here if you want to read more about it. Mozilla has a really good write-up about MIME types. Here's the INA. If you go follow this, we can look at all the official list. It's very, very long. There's a few different links to get to different sections. So if we want to go to fonts, that'll take us down here and we can see the types that are fonts. So for instance, if I wanted to look at, okay, well TTF, okay, so that's font TTF, but if I click this link, it'll tell you more about that specific type of file. So that's a really good place to go look up and find out what the official MIME types are for whatever you're trying to work with.
How did you get to those here?
So that's this link here, IANA. That's on their website. There's also this link here, which is a little bit less official, but more Microsoft official. And there's a lot of white space here, but the table's all the way down here. And there's all the standard MIME types for Word products or Microsoft Word family. So you can see, for instance, if it's a .doc, that's the MIME type for that. docx is this. So that's another good place to look as we're working with whether Word documents or Excel documents. Does that make sense? So that's where you can look those up. Some of those should still be on the official list, but they may or may not be because Microsoft's not as good at staying up with standards. So that being said, so that's talking about, we've talked about kind of MIME types and showing you what those are. Again, that's kind of just a way to know what kind of files you're dealing with, and specifically we'll tie it in here in a minute when we're looking at HTML. So coming back to the world of HTML, we've talked about some of this already, so some of this will be refresh and some of this will be new. Okay. So the first thing to remember anytime we want to upload files, which is what we're trying to get to, we need to make sure that we mark the form as ENC type is equal to multi-part form data. Okay, that's short for encoding type. Okay, and specifically you'll see that this is actually a MIME type as well. Multi-part form data is actually a MIME type. Now it has to be that anytime you want to include files in your form. Okay, if you don't need files on your form, you don't have to do that. But if you do want to have files that you're uploading from a form, it has to be that type. No other type will work. Okay. If we want an input tag, then upload files. Typically we do that by creating an input tag just like we're used to, but we'll set the type to file. Okay. So that's going to let the user pick a file from their local computer. Okay. There's two other parameters here that are of chief concern to us. One of these is the accept attribute. The accept attribute lets us say what kinds of files can you upload. If you don't specify the accept attribute, they can upload anything they want, and that might be a problem, right? So you probably want to restrict what kinds of files they can open, what kind of files they can upload. This will not specifically prevent them from doing that because the all files option will still show up typically. So you still usually have to do some enforcement with JavaScript and on the C# side to make sure that they can't upload other types of files. But this will get it so that at least the user interface, when they open up that window, only suggests files to them that fit what you've opened. Does that make sense? They would have to go to pick all files and go grab something else. Okay. If we want to specify more than one file type as being valid, we're going to separate them by commas. So let's say I want to allow images and audio. I might say image, comma, audio kind of thing. Okay. If I want to allow all image types, I can specify it as image/star. That's any image type that's out there on INA is valid. Okay. That includes PNGs and GIFs and JPEG, but it also includes all the other ones that you may not have heard of, or Photoshop files like PSDs. So you can't do this. It's probably a bad idea all the time, pretty much all the time, because there's so many other file formats out there. Probably don't want to take a PSD file, right? So that is one option that you can use, but it's usually not the one you necessarily want. You usually want to be a little bit more constrained than that. Okay. Similar thing, you might say audio, that's all audio files, or you could say all video files. Okay. That would allow that. Also, if we want to be maybe a little bit more specific, we can either give it a list, comma-separated list of the line types. So we can do, like, let's say we just want PNGs and JPEGs. We could do image/PNG, comma, image/JPEG. That'd be one way we could format it, but we can also give it as extensions. So if I say .gif, .jpg, .jpeg, .png, that would then just only allow them the commonly supported image types. Does that make sense? So that's usually, if we want to let the user upload an image, you want to set the accept to that, or something like that. Okay. Similarly, if they want only to upload spreadsheets, there's no easy group for spreadsheets because some of them land maybe in the text area and some of them land in the application area. So one way that you might specify that, you say .csv, .xls, .xlsx. These two being formats for Excel, and that being a standard kind of text-based comma-separated audio file. Okay. Questions there? Similarly for PDFs and Word documents, you might set it up like that. So if we're looking at the code of you actually making a form like this, right, putting those things together, we're going to have the ENC type here as form data. We're going to have the method as post. You do want to make sure that it's post and not get. And then we're going to have in here, this is where I'm putting that accept attribute. See? So here I'm saying only images, but you can upload any images. Questions? Okay. Another attribute that's out there is this multiple attribute. By default, you can only upload one file at a time. But there may be plenty of cases where you want to allow the user to select a group of files all at once. Okay, so if you add the multiple attribute to that, that's going to allow them to upload multiple files at once. There is a limit to that as far as how many files that they can upload at once, but that will generally unless you're uploading a few hundreds of files at the same time, that should be good enough. Questions? So that's how that lays out. And that's just kind of a review of the different HTML bits. That's as far as we need to know as far as the HTML is concerned. A lot of the rest of this stuff will deal with JavaScript and C# and some CSS style stuff that we can do as well to style it. Okay. If you're looking up resources about these properties, you can follow these links. They'll give you kind of some more info about those different properties and links. Okay. So one very important thing that we need to do often is to style those file uploads. And specifically, moreover, I want to style those because they look way different depending on what browser and operating system you're looking at. So this is kind of just a smattering of different operating systems and browsers and what their file upload controls look like. Okay, so you look at here, here's kind of the Internet Explorer route. Most of them have a box and a browse button on the right, right? Okay, most of them are set up that way. Safari's set up the other way, where they've got the browse button on the left and the list of files that you picked over here. And you can't, whereas here you can type in, or at least it looks like you can, here you can't. You got similar kind of setups there. And you can see that the buttons are all styled differently. Okay. So if you just leave it as is, just the raw HTML as an input type file, this is what it's going to look like on all your different browsers. It's going to look way different. Does that make sense? It's going to look way different depending on who's using it. Okay. So a lot of times we want to style that. Unfortunately, styling this is kind of a pain. And in a lot of ways, there's not a lot of CSS that you can do to even touch these. A lot of these different file inputs don't accept the normal kind of colors and borders and type of things that you apply it to, oftentimes. In fact, if we put form control on there, which is what we're used to putting on our text inputs, right? All it does is put a little border around whatever the browser decides to display. So if we're looking at IE Mobile, it's just going to add another border around that. That's all the form control is going to do. Or if I'm looking on Chrome, where's Chrome? Chrome here on Windows, it's just going to throw a border around that. It's not going to look the way that we want it to. Does that make sense? So styling them is a little bit difficult, to be fair. Okay? And there's a lot of, if you start going to look at information online, there's a lot of different techniques that people have proposed, and some of them are, suffice to say, pretty far out there, pretty bad ideas. So as far as different techniques, the one that we've really landed on that works nowadays and works well is what we actually do is we typically just hide that control. So we say, well, we can't style that, so we'll hide it and replace it. Does that make sense? We'll hide it and put our own kind of homespun thing there. Okay. And the way that we do that really revolves around, the best trick to do that revolves around exploiting the behavior of a label. Okay. So remember, anytime we're creating an input, we should always have a label with it, right? One reason is for us accessibility and usability, but it also means, screen readers can figure it out and such. Okay. Now, there's one very interesting behavior of a label. Okay. Anybody know what that is?
If you click on it, it will activate the associated control.
Right. So if I click on the label, it's just as if I clicked on the control. Right.
Isn't that only if you have the for attribute though?
Only if you have the for attribute, correct. But you should always have the for attribute. If you don't put in the for attribute, it's not a valid label, and you lose all of the benefits of it being a label. Okay, if you don't put the for attribute there, it actually would be better that it's just a div. It'd be blunt. It would be better if it's just a div if you don't put the for property there. So the for property says this is the control I'm bound to, and that means that it will activate it. There's actually two ways to do it though, to get that connection. So, one we can do that is we have the input, and I'll put the ID as foo, and the label here for is foo. So that's one way to bind those together, right? So the for attribute binds to the ID attribute, okay? So clicking on this is the same as clicking on that. In fact, it's the same as clicking on that even if it's hidden, which is nice. But only if it's hidden in the right way. The other way that we can set up this connection is label, and we put the input inside of it, actually. So if I do foo input that technique works as well. So if I put the input inside of the label, they also get bound. Either of those routes results in them getting bound together. Okay, so either of these routes can actually be used to do this technique. The technique specifically, what we're going to go through is going to be this one, that first one. But this is actually a way that you can get it working as well. Okay, just so you know. So both of these we can start from both of those, but it's going to change the CSS pretty drastically. The CSS that you write for this is very different than the CSS you write for that, as well as it changes some of the JavaScript as well. So that's the route that we're going. Okay. So one of the things that means, so it means clicks go through, it means focus events go through. Whenever I click on one of these file inputs, the upside of that is when you click on them, that's when it opens the browse dialog. Does that make sense? So when you click on the input, that opens the browse dialog, which means that when you click on the label, it opens the browse dialog. That's very important because there is no way in JavaScript to open that browse dialog. That's vital. It's because it's a security concern if you could. So it has to be triggered by a user event. You cannot trigger the browse dialog opening through code. Okay, which is why we need that label. Does that make sense? That's why we need to start there. Okay, so I said part of the trick is we need to hide the actual input. Okay. One upside of doing it this way, note that we're starting with an actual input. So if for some reason your browser doesn't support the CSS or the JavaScript that we need to make this happen, note that this originally, the raw HTML is still a valid input. That makes sense? So it's easy, it's relatively easy for us to, it's still possible for us to fall back on a browser that doesn't support this and have the native file input. Does that make sense? That's one upside to this. Okay, so we want to hide the file input. How can we do that? Somebody gives me some options. Because there's a few different ways to do that.
Type hidden.
Type hidden? Well, it has to be type, I can't make it type hidden. That's because it has to be type file. It has to be type file for you to pick a file.
Hidden attribute.
Hidden attribute? What do you mean?
Hidden for, there's a hidden attribute.
Okay, is that in CSS?
No.
Not the hidden true.
There is no hidden true.
Bootstrap class for
Okay.
the hidden class for Bootstrap.
So what hidden class in
Dot
Bootstrap?
D dash none.
You said what?
It's dot D dash none.
Which D-none is shorthand for what CSS? Because it means something in CSS.
Display equals none.
Display none, okay. So D none is the same as display colon none. So that's one option. So no, I can't make it a hidden input because it has to be a file input. Scott, you had a hand up?
Oh, I don't know. I was just saying hidden for.
Hidden for.
Hidden for.
Well, what does hidden for do? It generates a hidden field. That's an HTML helper we have. Right now we're just talking about HTML. Forget about C#, because C# just generates HTML. Okay, so I have to do this in CSS, really is where I need to do this. Because basically I can't change my HTML. My HTML has to be a file input.
You could set the position to fixed or absolute and then just move it somewhere they wouldn't be able to access it.
Okay.
That,
So position fixed and move it off screen.
yeah.
Okay, somebody give me a different technique. Because there's a lot of techniques actually.
I thought there was just a hidden attribute in HTML.
Not that I'm aware of.
I mean, on the W3 School it's here.
Okay. Well, suffice to say that one, I know for sure, if it is, it doesn't work for this. Because it, yeah, so if, okay, that one, either way I know that that one doesn't work. Because that takes it out as far as it's not existing, which actually means that it acts as if it's no longer there. So clicking on the label will no
So
longer.
would that be like
the
display
browse.
none?
So display none actually, as far as I remember, doesn't work either. So as far as I know, that one doesn't work. The HTML hidden definitely doesn't work. Because we have to kind of hide it, but also trick the browser into still recognizing the, thinking that it's there, if that makes sense. Because as soon as the browser thinks it's not on screen, it no longer takes any sort of events. Similarly, like if I use disabled on the input control, events don't happen anymore. So that one doesn't work. The disabled attribute, I know that one doesn't work. Give me some more clever techniques.
Could set the height and width to 0.
Ooh, that's a good one. Okay, so if we set both of those to 0, then effectively it's still there, but it's not visible.
With the opacity.
Okay, opacity. To transparent. Okay. Any other techniques?
Visibility hidden.
So visibility. I don't remember if I've tried that one. What happened last time I tried that one. So we may have to try a few of these. So the catch falls into this space of, again, we need the browser to think it's still there, even though it's not really user visible. That make sense? Another technique I could do is put it behind something. That one I'm not actually going to even put up there because there's a lot of usability problems that happen as soon as you try to do that one. But it is technically potentially a possibility, is to put the input behind something. But a lot of the browser, that leads into accessibility problems, and some of the browsers do detect that as being not quite kind of what you would want it to be. Okay. So yeah.
That's a z-index property, right?
Z-index. Yeah, you could do some stuff with z-index. You'd also have to use positioning to do that. So that would be positioning plus z-index. The problem is that the main problem with that is for some of these different areas behave differently, and those still have their difference of behavior sometimes. So for instance, this box might be something you can type into, in which case if you do behind, this is still something you can type into and doesn't open up the browse window, and the browse up button opens the browse window. Does that make sense? So you have to know where the browse button is, which is sometimes over here, and sometimes it's over there. So that's part of the problem with the Z-end, or putting it behind breaks down.
So just to clarify, the goal here is to be able to click the label.
Click the label,
And then the
and that opens up the window.
pin works just fine.
Does it?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we can try it. I know that disabled doesn't work, but we can try a few of those tricks. Okay, so I'm actually going to do this in VS Code. I know we haven't touched VS Code at all. But because we're just in HTML land, this may be a little bit easier. Let me see if I can change the theme on this. Help. I'll go here. Set color theme. There we go. Okay. Can everybody read the screen at this point? Okay. So I've got a basic setup here. I'm going to go ahead and comment out the CSS that I already have.
Is that code available anywhere?
Yeah, it's not available right now. That code, the important snippets are actually in the handout. If we look at the next page, but I'll upload it when we're done. We can take a look at it. Okay, so here is, let me comment out this part as well. And my JavaScript that I've got down below right now. So I may have been mistaken on that attribute. Let's see. So save. All right. So what we effectively have is this div that's got an input type file and a label for. Okay. So I'm going to run this on live server here. Okay. So here's what that looks like out of box. So here's my input control. Here's my label. If I click here, you can see that it opens up that browse window. Click on the button. But as far as Chrome's concerned, it doesn't matter where you click. You can see that doesn't matter where you click on the input, it opens up the browse window. If I click on the label, it's also opening up the browse window. Note that if I remove that for, so let's say this is just label here and I've just got input. Go back and look at this. See, now clicking on the label doesn't do anything. See how that is? So if I don't have a for, it's really just a span tag. It doesn't do anything fancy. In fact, instead of allowing me to click on it and do something, I'm now selecting the text. Okay. So that's important. Okay. So let's see that. Let's see a few of these techniques. Let's see if they work. So if I make this hidden, I'm going to go back here. Okay, so it's gone. Yep. Okay, so hidden does work. That's definitely one thing that's changed then. So hidden does work there. The one problem there is I can't, with doing that, is I can't remove that through CSS. I can't remove that hidden attribute like that through CSS. I can remove it through JavaScript, but I can't remove it through CSS, which ideally I want my base form to work just fine, assuming that there's no CSS. You know, without CSS and without JavaScript, it needs to work fine, especially without JavaScript, because that's the kind of fallback I want to work on the oldest browsers possible. If I make this disabled, see what happens there. If I say, you can kind of see how it's grayed out, clicking on it doesn't do anything, right? So if I disable the control, that doesn't happen. Let's try setting some styles up here now. So remember when I'm building up selectors, because again, point the ideal solution for me would be that I would do this through CSS rather than doing it through HTML, again, because fallbacks. Okay, so if I'm doing it through CSS, the selector I'm going to use is this, type equals file, and it's in those square brackets. Anybody remember what that square brackets means? What kind of selector is that? What kind of selector is that?
Is it an attribute selector?
It is an attribute selector. So what is that? Somebody else tell me what that does.
Will it apply the style to every element that has that attribute?
Okay. So specifically every tag that has a type equals file, right? Or if I wanted to maybe be more specific, I might say input type file. So every input that has an attribute of type equals file. Okay, which would actually be more specific. Okay. So let's start with that. And let's say we do display. Actually, I guess one thing we would need to try to do if we're going to do hidden or any of these is we probably actually need to try it on more than one browser, because that's also important. Oh, did I closed that. I need to keep that open. Downloads. Okay, so if I do display none, okay, I guess that does work. It does work at least in Chrome, but I seem to remember that it doesn't work in like Firefox or IE or something like that. So there's a bunch of these different techniques we can try. So that one seems to be working in Chrome. If I say display none, if I say what was the next one on here? Position. I'm going to skip the position fixed. I'll skip that one. So we looked at disabled. height and width is 0. Let's try opacity next. So opacity is 0. That works. It's gone. What changed though? And notice that if I hover over this area here, notice that there's a little tooltip. So it's sort of gone, but it's just gone in the sense that the user can't see it, but it's actually still there, right? So if I hover over it, it's still saying no file chosen as if it was there. So it does work, but it's not really ideal. Now, one reason why I put all these things up here and why I've asked you to think about that is what works today might not work in the future, right? So it might be that one particular route to making this work works now, but doesn't work later. So if you're looking online and saying, hey, here's a guide, and well, it worked at that time, right? There's a lot of different guides that say, okay, this is how you may be able to do this. Maybe that's going to change, right? So having a few different techniques to do something like this up your sleeve is a great thing. Again, because browsers change all the time, the standards, what they decide is a hack changes, what they decide is not a hack changes. So knowing what options are out there is a good thing. Okay, so opacity 0, that's the problem with that, is it ends up kind of still being there. What happens if I say, let's make the width and height not 0, but really small? No, I need to put in invalid syntax. So if I make it small but not 0, it's still kind of there, and you can potentially see a corner of it kind of poking out, right? If I make it exactly 0, okay, it seems to be gone. Again, browser dependent. So problem with this is the technique that they did have on the article that I looked up, and it's a pretty good technique. But the thing to be aware of with this is not all browsers treat width and height 0 the same way. So in Chrome, if we shrink it down to width and height 0, what are a few things that are happening? It's actually disappearing. The browser's still treating it as if it's there, but it's not overflowing the bounds of that 0. Does that make sense? It's not going outside of those bounds. On some browsers, it will, if I remember right. So if I just say 0, 0, on some versions of browsers, you will still actually see it there. It will just be underneath the label instead of being completely gone. Okay. So one thing we can do there is we can add in overflow hidden. What overflow hidden does is it says if there's anything outside of the bounds, I want to hide it. Okay, and we can kind of test that if I play around with the label. So if I say the label is width 10 pixels, you can kind of see what's happening there. It's falling down, right? So if I look at that, so I've said the label is 10 pixels wide. Do you think this label is wider than 10 pixels? Right? So it's not actually necessarily obeying that. And if I were to say overflow hidden, see what happens? That's getting rid of the parts that are going outside the bounds. So if I say width, height, as long as I've got overflow hidden, there's nothing there. If I say overflow visible, which is kind of the default in most browsers, that's what it would look like. You see? So that's why if we're going to do the height and width technique, we need to make sure that we put in overflow is hidden. Any questions there? So this is kind of the recommended, at least the currently recommended way to do it is set the width and height to 0, simply because that's the one that's least likely for the browser to decide that, oh, you're doing something nefarious, if that makes sense, or decide that, oh, it's not on screen, so therefore I should treat it as disabled, right? Because as far as it's concerned, it's still there. Okay. Whereas if I say hidden, it might work now, it might not work in the future. That makes sense? It might be something the browsers decide to change. So that's kind of hopefully future-proofing a little bit. Now, with that, I still see, oh, I didn't save, that's why. With this, I still see that my label doesn't really look very friendly, right? If I were to look at that, who thinks that that's something I can click on? Just by looking at that text. Probably not, right? So in order to make it something that looks like I can click on it, well, first of all, you'll notice what's the cursor, right? Cursor is just my regular pointer. It doesn't change as I hover over it, right? So that's one of the first things I want to change. So I'm going to change that this way. I'm going to add in another selector. So I'm going to say input type file plus label, okay? What does that plus do? What does that plus mean?
Apply that to both elements?
Nope.
Or not elements.
It targets a neighboring element.
Okay, you're close. Looking for something more exact. Hey, Brendan, what's that plus mean? So I said input plus label.
Look it up.
You said look it up?
I looked it up. You want me to say it?
Okay.
It's an adjacent selected.
It's a what?
So this selects the adjacent.
Adjacent, which usually we talk about that as a sibling selector, but it is adjacent. What were you going to say?
I was going to say sibling.
Yeah. So sibling is usually the word we use for that. But it is, adjacent would be another way to describe it. But the formal term is sibling. So if you think about kind of a hierarchy as far as your family is concerned, right? A sibling is somebody that's at the same level in the family tree as you are, right? So it's the same level of the tree, the same level in the HTML as the input. It's not beneath it. It's not above it. It's next to it. Okay? So, and it's not both, because it only applies to the label. It only applies to the label at the end. It doesn't actually apply anything to that. Okay? There's another important thing in there. So it's a sibling, but remember you have siblings on both sides, right? So you have siblings that are older than you and siblings that are younger than you, right? So is it the sibling that comes before the input or after the input? Or is it either one? So hands up for either one, hands up before, and hands up for after.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so it's always after. If I say plus, it's always after. So one of the things that means, so let's say we're going to make this real quick, just make this background red. So right now that works. If I were to switch these around and put the label before, note that it doesn't work anymore, right? Because it only applies to the label that's after the input. Does that make sense? Now, let's say we leave it flipped around and we switch these. So I'm going to say label plus input, okay? So that would mean I want a label, I want an input that comes after the label, right? Well, in this case, the input does come after the label, but nothing's turning red. Let me get rid of this real quick and see what turned red is actually the file input. So whatever I put as that plus, that second part is what I'm targeting. Does that make sense? When I do that adjacent selector, I'm always targeting the second item. Okay? Which means that if I put the label before it, if I put the label before the input, I actually have no way to make that adjacent selector work and target the right thing. So the label does actually, in order for this adjacent selector trick to work, it does have to actually be after the, it does actually have to be after the input as far as the HTML is concerned. Okay. So that's one thing there. It does have to be after. But what if because that does create a little bit of a problem. What if I want to actually have, what if for some reason I want to fall back to the original view, and in that view I really want the label to be first. How can I make the label be first without changing that HTML?
There's the order property with flexbox.
So that's one option, right? So I can use that if I did need a fallback. Unfortunately, there's a little bit of a problem there because Flexbox is newer, so it's probably not supported on the older browsers where I'm going to need to do that. But it would be supported on newer browsers. Okay. So in that case, I might actually, for older browsers, I might actually end up needing to use floats. Because floats I can use on older browsers to change the order. Jeremy, you had a hand up a second ago? Okay. So we've seen that we can apply some styling to this label. And the reason that I'm doing it that way, because if we think about it, if I just did it as just label, that would apply to every label on the screen, right? That might be a problem, right? I don't want to turn every label in the screen to look like a button, because what I want to do is just turn the ones that are after a file input into buttons. Makes sense? All right, so let's change that pointer. So in order to change the pointer, I'm going to use cursor pointer. And now when I hover over it, you see it kind of gives you that hand. That's a really, really important little usability thing. It's very easy to forget to do that anytime you want to make something look like a button, but it's a very important trick to make sure that if you're turning something into a button, make sure the cursor changes.
Assuming you put Bootstrap button classes on the label.
We might be able to do that. And that's kind of what we'll get to in a minute. But right now I want to talk about how to do it without Bootstrap. So we'll come back to Bootstrap in a minute. You're not on a bad track.
I was thinking, isn't there like a colon hover?
There is a hover.
So where?
And there's also a colon focus.
Right. So why in this situation why do we not just use the colon hover on the label tag? Or are we using this selector instead of just doing like label colon hover and changing the cursor there?
Well, again, if I just did label colon hover, that would be all the labels.
Right, but
that would be all the labels on the entire page.
Oh, I mean, yeah, that's true.
Right. The point of the adjacency selector is I only want to select some of the labels. Right. The hover is useful if I wanted it to change as I hover over it. So if I want to, let's make it look like a button. Let me go through that. So I'm going to add in, here's the code that I'm going to add in. So that makes it basically look like a button. I give it a color of white. I make it display inline block, background color, some border radius, and some padding. So twiddle a little bit, and we basically have a button. Okay. You're asking about hover. So let's say we want to change it to be a little bit different when we hover. I do need that whole first bit, again, because I only want to apply this to labels that come after file inputs. So I'm going to do label : hover after that first bit. And there I might say, well, let's make the background a little bit darker when you hover over it. There it goes. And for accessibility, one thing to remember: anytime you put in hover, remember you also need to put in focus, because if somebody's just using the keyboard or they're simply that kind of thing, that won't work. It won't change color as I'm tabbing through. It'll only change color as I'm hovered over it. So for mobile as well as for keyboard usage, we would make it something like that. Hover focus, so that when I can kind of tab through it, it would get there. Now there is a bit of an issue there, because you'll notice I can't actually tab to it. Right? Normally I can tab to buttons.
Is that because the input's in?
So the inputs can be tabbed to. Labels normally can't be tabbed to. Remember? Labels normally can't be tabbed to, because in fact it usually skips them in your tab order. Right? And that's intentional. So if I want to add something into the tab order, I actually go back to the HTML. This is one thing I do have to do through the HTML, unfortunately. Tab index 0. If you put in tab index 0, now you can tab to it, whereas you normally couldn't. Okay. Does that answer the question you're asking about focus?
Yeah, it does.
So that's what it would look like. If we're trying to deal with making it so that when you hover over it or when you focus it, that it changes styling, we still need the whole this part, because again we don't want to target all the labels. And that's how we would specify something like that. Okay. Let's go ahead and take a quick break and come back at 1:55. Mm-hmm.
It's been a while since I've messed with any kind of package manager, or I mean Sublime, CSS. So here, from the code, over this bit right here.
Haven't gotten that yet. We're still looking at just this.
I wanted to duplicate what you were doing, and then I'll put it right. Like it's still different. This thing right here, a little strange to me.
It's an attribute select. Okay, that's what we're talking about. So it's an attribute select. So you're selecting anything that has that attribute. You see type equals. But also added in input to make it a little bit more restrictive. So only input tags, because otherwise it's any tag that has that.
Oh, I see. So like, if I, for instance, put label type file, or I can mess
That
with
would apply to that. Yeah.
if you don't want that.
Yeah, I just want it input type file. So, or other things that have file.
Okay.
So that's to distinguish it from things like text inputs, right? Because I don't want to apply the styling, I don't want to hide my text inputs, I just want to hide my file inputs.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So if I didn't use that attribute selector, then I'd be hiding all the inputs.
I see. Yeah, I was looking for brackets or whatever, and I realized, well, I tried to do it in Notepad too, and
Yeah.
I'm a little unfamiliar with Notepad, so I was kind of like,
Yeah.
how's that one open?
Yeah, you can do it with, I would do Notepad++ over Notepad, but yeah, you can do it in there too.
I remember in the HTML class I started with brackets and stuff, but then I
Yeah.
just trying different stuff. I messed with Sublime for a little bit.
Yeah, I'm just jumping into VS Code, but VS Code's it's basically the same. We're really just looking at the code. It's the program doesn't matter too much for what we're doing.
What's the time to get back?
1:55.
Do you remember all the names of like, the good packages? So it took me a minute, but Winter, I think it was Beautify.
I don't completely know. They're different. I mean, which you're using Sublime?
Yeah, right now.
Yeah, I don't know offhand, and they're different. I've not used Sublime, so I don't know what the ones are. The most popular, just having done some research online, the most popular one seems to be VS Code nowadays, mostly for like JavaScript stuff.
Yeah, I was just looking at the packages, and there's so many.
Okay, why is my... There it goes. I hope most of that recorded.
put a work order in for that squeaky door.
Oh, okay. You got figured out what was up with AWD right near you?
We had the LAN party and they changed some network configuration and
Okay.
basically
Took it offline.
took it offline.
Yeah.
So it's online now until I think tomorrow around
Mhm.
maybe the afternoon or something.
And that's gonna be off on Saturday too,
Yeah.
because they're taking the whole building down. Another reason to get it up on AWS or Azure or something.
Yeah.
Okay. So what we've looked at so far, again, the code for this is here. Just some basic HTML and the CSS code that goes with that. Okay. So that's the kind of the simplest basic version of that technique. There are a few things still to point out. Note that when I click a file, when I pick a file here, there's no indication as to which file I picked or that I haven't picked a file. So as that stands, that's not too terribly user-friendly. If I were to say, if I was just saying right now, as far as if you pick a file, you can't see that it's picked. If I were to go back to the original the original text here, and let's say I comment that CSS out, let's look at what it looked like before I did anything to it. So before I did anything to it, I could still click and pick a file, and you can see it'll tell me what file name I've picked, or if I don't pick a file, just hit cancel, it'll say no file chosen, right? So we lose that behavior so far with what we've done. That makes sense? The only way to get that behavior back is we do have to use some JavaScript code to get that list of files that we picked back. Okay. There's a lot of different ways to do that. What I would advise you, if you're interested in how to do that, which definitely is something you want to know how to do, and is often something we want to do in addition to Bootstrap, because Bootstrap doesn't give us all the code to do that. If you look at these links down here below, they'll go through some of the JavaScript to make that happen. So the first one here, styling file inputs the best way, styling customizing file inputs the smart way. Those two articles both talk about using this technique and different tools and tricks that you can use on top of this. But that gives you enough to kind of get started and kind of understand the basics of how that works. Okay. But there is more stuff that we have to do where you have to say if the file changes, then go show the list of files that you've selected, whether it be one file or multiple files. Okay. So using Bootstrap, however, Bootstrap does provide a custom, what they call a custom input for this. If you look for custom file input, you will find it. You can follow that link in there too. And it allows you to kind of build these together with input groups and make them look pretty good. However, I think that, yeah, so if I pick a file, you see it still doesn't show me what file I've picked, right? So that's one of those things that you still have to get into the nitty-gritty on the JavaScript and mess with to make it actually show what files you picked. But the basic JavaScript, the basic HTML to make that work, and take this snippet and bring that into VS Code. Actually, let me duplicate this so that we're not looking at the same. File, save. I'm going to add a new file. Bring that in with mnet. And I've got the script tags here. There we go. Okay. So there's my basic setup. File, save. And that's kind of how it looks. Now I may need to put on a little bit of margin on the actual page. Class equals P3. So we can see that. So that's what it's going to give us. If we follow this structure, we're going to have a section or an area here where we can choose a file, as well as a browse button, and if we click anywhere in there, we can then pick a file. It just won't tell us what file we picked. So let's look at that real quick. So the HTML that we have here, so we start on the outset, we've got what's called an input group, and we've already done some stuff with an input group, because remember I showed you how to build the search box with that, a search bar. So input group is what we're putting on the outside. that's what is allowing us to combine two controls like this, where there's just kind of a flat line in the middle, but curved ends on both sides. So I've got an input group on the outside. Inside of that, I've got this div of type custom file. So custom file is a Bootstrap class, and that's primarily what you use if you're building your own file inputs. So you're going to start with custom file. You'll also note that the actual input is marked with custom file input, and the label is marked with custom file label. The upside of both of those being marked now, one with one tag and one with the other, means that it doesn't have that same dependency as we had with that adjacency selector. So in Bootstrap, because we're using separate classes here, I can't actually have the label before the file input, and it's fine. That makes sense? Because I'm using three separate classes instead of using an adjacency selector to say, well, it's nearby. So that's how that works. So you just need to know input group, and then custom file, and the custom file input, custom file label. Those are the classes that you apply to make that work. Any questions on the Bootstrap there?
You said input and
Input label. So the top one here, actually open it up here, go back to my handout. So we've got input group, we've got custom file. You see the input's labeled custom file input. The class on the label is custom file label. So those are the three classes that you have to make sure that you have to make the Bootstrap happy.
with just that bit of code there is
Uh-huh.
the choose file button. Didn't have the.
So you should be getting, assuming you have the Bootstrap style sheet and JavaScript, you should be getting something like this. One of the things to notice here, as far as the Bootstrap's concerned, and this is a little bit odd, so notice it says choose file here. So the text in the label that's the text that's appearing here. So if you wanted to change the text that's appearing there, especially through JavaScript, so for instance to say, oh, you pick 3 files or you pick this file, that's what you would need to do in the JavaScript is change the text that's inside that label. Okay, because that's where that's coming from. Questions there? Keep moving. So that's how you style it. So you've kind of seen how to do it with CSS. You've seen a little bit of how to do that with Bootstrap. The next thing we want to, now that we've kind of talked about the front end, we need to kind of go back and talk a little bit more about the back end again. So the first thing to remember, if we want to accept a file from the front end, okay, remember there's two things, there's one thing we had to do first of all on the front end. What did we have to do to the form tag? We had to add an attribute, right? What was that attribute?
You can see type
Multi-part form data. Okay. So, and it's form dash data, if I remember right. Okay, so that's got to be there. We also need to have a parameter on the back end that's type HTTP posted file base. Okay. There is in C#, there is a class named HTTP posted file. That one will not work. If you put posted file instead of posted file base, you won't actually get any files. And the reason is HTTP posted file dates back to ASP.NET Classic, if you remember what he was talking about when he was here. It's actually from that. And the reason that a lot of those older classes don't work anymore, or they're not supported in MVC, is because they didn't support unit testing. They didn't support the mocking that was needed for unit testing. So that's why we're using the base class instead, this new base class, in order to support unit testing. And that's why MVC only supports that one instead of supporting the other one. Okay. If I want to receive multiple files, I just need to make it an array. So if I make it a single HTTP posted file base, I can only take one file from the client. If I make it an array, then I can take one or more. So for sure, if you have multiple set on the client, you should definitely have it be an array. But this will actually even work if the front end is not set to multiple, even if it's just single. You'll just end up with an array with one or nothing in it. So that's what you do there if you want to have more than one file come from the server. You just make it an array. Again, don't use HTTP posted file. Okay. Now, typically when we're doing file uploads, another consideration you want to take into account, we usually want to do it through AJAX. Nearly always, if you're uploading files, you should do it through AJAX. One of the reasons for that is because if we don't, that will cause a page refresh, right? The whole point of using AJAX is to prevent a page refresh. Well, when you submit a form with files, when that page refreshes, they won't have any files picked. So they'll go have to pick them again if something went wrong. Okay, that always happens. If there's a page refresh, the browser will forget which files they picked, and there's no way around that. As long as there's a page refresh, those will be forgotten. Okay, so typically we want to make sure that when we submit these forms, when we're uploading files, we want to make sure we're doing it over AJAX. Does that make sense? Simply for the point of we want it to, if something goes wrong, or if they need to hit submit again, or whatever the case is, if there's some other validation error where they left off the name, or there's some other different fields that they forgot filled in, we want to make sure that those files are still selected. Essen, you had a hand up briefly? Okay. So that's one reason. The other thing that we can do with AJAX that we can't do without a post is give the user some sort of indication as to the progress. Okay. So if you do a file upload without AJAX, the browser's going to just sit there and give you a spinny thing like this until it's done. It's just going to look like the browser's not doing anything. So if that file is a 5 GB size file, it might be, your browser might be sitting there and looking unresponsive for an hour, depending on your file upload speed, right? So that's not very user-friendly to the user. In fact, more than likely, if that happens, it might be that your browser times out, which means that you only upload part of the file, and you can't actually upload the entire file because the browser won't wait that long. Okay. So it's really important that if we are going to upload files, we can do that with a post, but that really only works for small files. If you want to upload big files, you need to do it through AJAX. Okay. So we'll look at the JavaScript code that we need to kind of look at those progress events in a minute. But that's one thing that you need to know, is typically if we're going to upload files, we want to make sure we're using our AJAX methods to do that. Okay, so for uploading multiple files at once, here's kind of some example code for making that work. Again, this is assuming that I've set the input type to multiple. Okay, so I can take some model data in, just like usual. Whether or not you have that model data is entirely optional. Right? If you don't have any other fields than this one input file, then you don't need a model. Okay? But oftentimes you're going to have some additional metadata that you want the user to fill in with the files they're uploading. Does that make sense? Usually you're not just going to have a single file input. Okay, so we're going to take that data plus there. Just like usual, we're going to check if the model state is valid. If not, just send them back and say, hey, what you gave me isn't valid. We're done. Okay. If I do have some model data, here I would put my logic to save it to the database. Okay. Then I'm going to loop over through the files. So we're going to loop through for each file. Say as long as it's not null, we want to save it. Now, what I'm doing here, I'm saving it actually to disk. I am not saving it to the database.
Is that my files or is that files?
Yeah, and for each.
Oh, that should be my files. You're right. Yeah, that should be my files. So I'm looping through the files and I'm saving them to disk. Okay. Anytime I'm uploading files, I really do have that option. We talked about, we looked at uploading images to the database, but this is also looking at, I want to upload a file and save it to disk. The problem with saving it to the database is that that means that then I have to deal with the database anytime I want to get those files. And the databases, there's pretty much no database out there that's optimized to deal with files well. It's the reason we have file storage servers and other different ways of storing files that aren't in databases. So typically we don't necessarily want to do that. The upside of putting it in the database is that it does mean that all your files are kind of together with the data, together with the metadata. Does that make sense? So that is the one upside of putting into the database, is it does mean that they're together. Unfortunately, it does have a lot of performance problems, so it's not usually the thing we want to do. Okay? So we'll also in this, we'll talk about saving those files to disk. But this will work for saving any type of file. So the first thing I want to do, whether it be, and this works whether it's a spreadsheet, whether it's an image, whether it's a HTML file, doesn't matter. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use this method path.getFileName. Path is a standard class in C# that provides us with a lot of different methods to deal with file names. Okay. So one of them is getFileName. GetFileName will strip off the portion of this. So file is this HTTP posted file. This actually can sometimes include an entire path. So it might include the path to where it was on the user's computer, or where it is temporarily as it's sort of in the process of being uploaded. So what we want to do is strip off all that extra path information. I don't care what directory it's in. I just want to know the name and extension of the file. Okay, so that's what that will do. Give you path.filename will just give you the name and the extension of the file, and get rid of the path, get rid of the directory. So I've got input file name. The next thing I want to do is I want to save it. I want to figure out where I'm going to save it to. So I've got my file name, but I also need to figure out the directory on the server computer where we're going to save it. Okay. So if I say that I have a folder on the server called upload files, it's not necessarily going to be this. It's going to be whatever you choose, right? And you kind of choose that depending on what your context is. But for this, we're going to say, okay, we'll upload all the files to a folder called upload files, uploaded files. Okay, so the path to that folder is tilde uploaded files. Okay, you've kind of seen that tilde before, right? What does that tilde mean?
Start at the root folder, the root directory.
You're sort of right.
Is it the ISS folder?
The what?
The
IIS folder? Sort of. So it is a root, but it is a specific root, right? So when we talk about roots, root means it's the very top of the directory structure, okay? If I mean the root in Windows, I'm usually actually talking about the C drive, right? On a Windows computer, the root is your C drive, typically. Or if I'm on the D drive, it would be the D drive, right? So the root is going to be the drive letter on Windows. Well, that's not the place where I want to save these files. I don't want to save these files at C:uploaded files. I want to save them somewhere else, right? So I want to save them with the website, right? So if I did just do / uploaded files here, well, that might be something different. But tilde says it's the root of the website. Does that make sense? Tilde is the root of the website. not just any old root, but it's the root of the website, or what we would call the root of the virtual directory. Okay? So because anytime you're working with a file server, it looks kind of like you're exploring directories and files, right? But I'm sure we've all seen, well, if I'm going to index.html, index.html is probably not on my C drive, right? Even though it looks like it's on my C drive. Even though it looks like it's on the root from the web server. So it's what we call virtual. So you have the physical disk, which is how things are actually laid out on a hard drive, and you've got the virtual paths, which is what you see from the web server. That make sense? So this is a virtual path. So relative to the root of the website, it's the uploaded files directly. So I'm taking this virtual path and I'm passing it into server.mappath. Server.mappath takes that virtual directory and turns it into a physical directory. Okay, so where this might start with /, this is now going to, after I run it through server.mappath, it will be C : blah blah blah. That makes sense? Because that's the path I need to have in order to actually save it to disk. I can't save it to disk using a virtual directory because Windows does not know about that virtual directory. It doesn't know where to put it. So it needs to have a physical directory in order for us to save a file. So we take the virtual, we turn it into a physical, and then we're combining these two things. So I'm saying, take the directory where I want to save it, plus the file name, combine those. So path combine says take these multiple parts of my path and put them together. Okay? And typically that's just a concatenation. Typically that's just a concatenation. However, there are some special characters, remember, in paths. So if I do a single dot at the beginning of the path, what does that mean?
Current directory.
So single dot means current directory. Double dot means a parent directory. Or if I start with a /, that means root. Okay, so if this was if the second thing was / my favorite pony, instead of just my favorite pony.png, it would be / my favorite pony.png, this would go up all the way up to the C drive. Okay, so if that second part started with a /, this file would actually be saved as C : my favorite pony. It would be saved on the C drive instead of being saved in uploaded files. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you're using path combine. Path combine takes care of a lot of those things, dealing with those special characters and dealing with combining paths in the right way, rather than just concatenating. But it does have those different behaviors. So that's something you have to keep in mind. But because we've made this into, we said just strip off the file name portion, we don't have to worry about those behaviors here. It's just going to effectively be effectively just a plus. Okay, so I've combined those two parts of the path, so the directory and the file name. Then I'm going to say save file.saveas, and that's going to save it to the disk. Simple as that. Does that make sense? So figure out the file name, figure out what directory we want it to go to, and combine that, and then finally save it to disk. Those are the three basic steps that we have to do anytime we want to save those uploaded files to disk.
So why do we want to save the file information on the database as well as on the disk?
So oftentimes, yes. So oftentimes we want to do a little bit of both. So for instance, if I am keeping track of what images go with products, right? Well, best thing for me to do is actually to do like this and save the image onto disk. That means we can load it up quicker, it makes performance a lot faster for a lot of different reasons, including caching and things like that. I still need to know, however, what image goes with which product. That make sense?
Oh, okay. Yeah,
I still need to know how to associate the image with the product, or to know if the product even has an image, right? So that's where I need to store something in the database to know there is a file and it's here on disk. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
So that can be just the file name. If I know that all my product images are in the same folder, all I need to store in the database is just the name of the file. Make sense? If I have my files in different directories, so some products images are in this folder and some project images are in that folder, I probably want to specify a more complete path to the file. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I probably want to specify it relative to the root of my website. Not the relative to the C drive, but relative to the root of the website. And that way I know where it is. So it all depends on what your kind of situation is, right? So if I'm putting my product images in here and my newer product images or my older product images, or I have like, okay, for this year, 2018 product images are in this folder, 2019 folders are in 2019 images are in this folder, I would probably need to put that into my path that I'm saving in the database to know what year to look into. So that's what I need to store, is I need to know which image goes with which product.
Okay.
And that we can store fairly efficiently. It's the actual data of the image is what we can't store efficiently in the database. Okay. So that's what that looks like. If I wanted then at the end to say how many files are uploaded, I could say files.length, send a message back to the user, and this would say, okay, you picked 3 files, and show 3 files uploaded successfully. Does that make sense? Now, I do want to talk a little bit. I talked a little bit about the path class here already. Let me delve into some of that again a little bit more thoroughly and define those things. So, a virtual path, that's the path from the perspective of the browser. So typically for us, that will start with a tilde. The physical path, that's where it is on the hard drive. So that's the difference between physical and virtual. And physical usually starts with C:. As long as you're running on Windows, it will start with C:/. If you're starting, or if you were on, and you're going to have multiple drives on Windows, so it could be D/, D:, E:, F:, whatever. Okay. But that's what it's going to start with. Now, another term that often comes up when we talk about absolute paths. Absolute paths are the entire path to the file or the directory, including the root, right? All the way back to the root. So for Windows, that root usually starts with C. On Linux, just a minor note, that root is /. So the root on Linux is always /. There's no C:, there's no D:, there's no drive letter at the beginning. It's always / is the root in Linux. It does come up.
What's the difference between absolute and physical?
Huh?
What's the difference between absolute and physical?
So typically those are the same thing. One thing to know, so physical means that I'm talking about where is it on the drive. Virtual means that where I'm talking, sorry, they're not necessarily the same thing. So physical means I'm talking about where is it on the drive. Virtual means I'm talking about where it is from the web server, the browser's perspective. Okay. Now I can have an absolute path that's virtual. I can also have an absolute path that's physical. Does that make sense? So the absolute path in terms of virtual would be back to the root of the website, which would start with / more than likely, versus an absolute path on the drive would be starting with C. Does that make sense? Both worlds can have absolute, but they refer to different things, and they have a different root.
So it's about kind of context.
It's context, right? Absolute means you have the entire thing, versus relative, which is the next point on here. Relative means you only have part of it, right? Absolute means you have the entire path, whether physical or virtual. But relative means you just have one portion of it. So relative says, from the current directory, here's how you get to it. Does that make sense? So relative is relative to where we are at the moment. Okay. We also talk about file names. File names always typically include the extension. We do include the extension as part of the file name. As far as talking about extensions, that I'm sure everybody's familiar with, but that's the last part that comes after the last dot. You can actually have file names with more than one dot in them. So, for instance, one particular type of thing you'll often run into is something called a tarball. So I could say foo.tar.gz. Tar.gz is what we call a tarball, and you'll see that almost a lot on the Linux world. The extension here is technically just GZ, as far as C# and most languages are concerned. So the extension is really just the .gz, whereas the entire file name is the whole thing. That make sense? One thing to know as far as the length of extensions, they're usually 1 to 4 characters after the dot. A lot of them, 3 being the most common, but there are ones like HTML that are 4, there are ones that are actually just 1 character. Technically, however, there is no limit. File names could be 250 characters long. I mean, extensions can be 250 characters long.
Is publish.xml again, or?
So in that case, just .xml is actually the extension. That makes sense? Visual Studio will treat it as publish.xml as being the extension, but realistically, as far as C# is concerned, the extension is just the .xml part. That makes sense? Okay, so working with the path class, there's a lot to read there. It is a very big class. There are a lot of utilities. All of these methods, though, are static, so they're relatively easy to call. The 3 main ones that we use here are going to be path combine, which is going to combine multiple paths together, path get file name, which will give us the file name, and path.get extension, which will just give us the extension portion. So those are the 3 you want to be intimately familiar with. You can look at the whole path class. There are a lot of useful methods there. I think the path class in C# is probably the best one I've seen of any language. But that's the 3 that we really care about for this class. Any questions on that? So that terminology comes up a lot, and I just wanted to make sure we had that down. And server map path, like we talked about, that's what we use to transform a virtual path into a physical path. Okay, that method is accessible through your controllers or through your views. You can't get it, though, outside of a request. A similar thing where you need an HTTP context, so we can't get to server map path from our tasks, or scheduled tasks. We can't get to them.
How would you use it?
So we wouldn't use it. So instead, so again, on the side of scheduled tasks, if we need a map from virtual to physical, we have to basically do it ourselves. We have to know what the root of our website is, effectively. So, like, I would have to effectively, if I was working on IWT Rankin EDU, I would need to hard code that IWT Rankin EDU somewhere, or have it be in some sort of configuration that I could get to.
Like you could put could you use like a map path in like a utilities class, then call it from there, like if it was like static or something?
Well, no, there's no way to make that static, because the problem is it relies on an HTTP context.
Oh, okay.
And suffice to say, you can't get that from a static context.
Okay.
And you shouldn't.
Right, yeah.
There are some things out there that may look like you can get it from a static context. Just understand that you can't. Because there is something there called HTTP context.current, which has some very weird behaviors in the sense that it's there under certain circumstances and not in others. So sometimes it's null and sometimes it's set to the context when you're dealing with a request. But when we're dealing with scheduled tasks, we don't know when those are firing off. We don't know what context we're going to get. We're going to get maybe a random request context that's in the middle of working, and we might have that at the beginning of our task and not at the end.
Yeah.
So don't use that. So if we do need to do things with paths typically, we're going to have to hard code some settings. Not hard code systems. We'll have to put some configuration in, or we can use environment variables, right? Environment variables are another way to deal with that. Is to say I need to put my root address of my website into an environment variable and store it there. That make sense? That's a legitimate way to do it. And then I would just use path combine. So if I know the root, then I can just use path combine to say, take that root plus the relatives and figure it out. But server map path allows you to not have to know what the root of your website is. That's the upside kind of thing. Especially with some websites that may have more than one root. Okay. So that's how we work with some of the C# side. Coming back to the front end, we can use jQuery to listen for events as far as how the progress of the file is going, as far as the upload goes. Specifically, we can use the XHR object, which we mentioned briefly when we talked about Ajax, but we didn't really do anything with it. Here we kind of have to do something with it to make it work. So, there's two kind of different events that are sent. So the first one is the progress event, and that says, hey, I've uploaded so many bytes. So it tells you how many bytes of the total has it uploaded. There's also a load event, which is fired when it's completed uploading the files. Now, note that the load event is fired before we get a response from the server. Okay, so we'll get progress events, boop, 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 and then finally we'll get a load event once all the files have been uploaded. But later after that, that's when our done actually gets called. Our done doesn't get called until we get a response from the server. Does that make sense? So depending on how long it takes you to go from uploading the files to all the processing that may need to happen on the server, there may be a big gap between load and done. Okay. So another thing to know, we use the shorthand methods, get and post, right? That's what we've done so far with Ajax. In order to use this XHR object, we do have to go back and use the long form Ajax method. Okay, because the long form Ajax method is where we can get at that XHR object. We can't get at it in the short and the get and post, the short ones. Okay, so the basic structure of that, we start by calling $.ajax. In here we need to specify the URL where we're going, as well as the method is being post, as well as the data that we're sending. Okay, so those are things we have to add in there. After all that, we can do XHR : and here we give it a function that's going to create that XHR object. Now, when we create that XHR object, that's where we have the option to then register events. So we tell it, create a new XHR. So we say new window.xml HTTP request. So that's going to create a new object. And you can see at the end here, we're returning that object. So that's the basic structure of that function. We create an object and then we return it. In the interim, that's where we can set settings. So we're saying XHR.upload.add event listener. So that lets us add an event to find out what's happening. So we're saying listen to the progress event and then run this function when that happens. Okay, so we're going to say if the length is computable, then go calculate the percentage, and then we're just going to write that to the console. Okay, so calculating percentage, as far as the event's concerned, we get two properties. evt.loaded, that tells us how many bytes have been uploaded so far. And then evt total is how many bytes all of our files together are, right? So if we're uploading 3 files, that's the total sum of all those 3 files, their file sizes. So I can say divide that by the total, that gives me a percentage, multiply that by 100 to get it to nice user-friendly display, and then I'm going to floor. So floor is going to round it down. So if we're at 3.2%, I'm going to round it down to 3%. So that gives me a nice integer percentage that's from 0 to 100. Okay. What I'm going to write out here, I'm then using a template string. You can see the kind of ticks on either end. And in here I'm saying %.toFix, right? So remember, toFix takes a floating point number and it's going to turn it into a string. And in toFix, that argument tells it how many digits do we want after the decimal point. So I was saying I don't want any. Scott, you had a hand up.
What's EBT?
That's the event. See, that's the input. That's the input arg to this function. I'm using a lambda syntax here. So this is the input parameters, and this is the actual body of the function right there. Where? Oh, you're right.
What makes the length computable? Is that like about how much is?
It's really hard to say. You'd have to see if you can find that online. I don't know what the answer. I don't know what the answer is. All I know is that if this is true, then we get the loaded and the total. But if this is false, then we don't get loaded and total. So we don't know how long it's going to take, basically.
Right.
My guess is more than likely that's going to happen early in the process when it's started the upload. So it's probably going to more likely be that for the first few events, and then switch over to computable is my guess.
Yeah.
But there are also cases where, let's say you uploaded certain files from Linux that are generated kind of dynamically. You don't necessarily know the size of those files. So there are some files on Linux, if you were to upload that file, you wouldn't necessarily know how long it is.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
So if for most files you should be able to see that, but there are some weird cases where this is generated by the operating system, or it's actually not really a file. It's really more of a stream. Then you wouldn't know how long it is.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's what that exists for there. So in that case, we just basically put some sort of spinny animation there to say, hey, it's working. I don't know how long, I don't know how close it is to done, but it's working. So we might put that in as an else.
So like for our purposes, length computable is pretty arbitrary. And we don't really...
Just assume it's going to be true most of the time.
Okay.
So can you make this work with the Bootstrap progress bar?
Yes, you absolutely can. So the code I'm doing right here is just the I'm just writing out to the console log to keep it simple. But if you can understand how to do this, then you can understand how to do it with Bootstrap. So here Bootstrap, so with this I'm just saying write the percentage out, and then when this event happens I'm saying write out the message upload completed. Okay. So if you can understand how that code works, you can easily understand how to do it with Bootstrap, and I've got that on another slide, how to kind of look at the Bootstrap stuff. And I've got a code example for that too. So does that make sense? So there's a loaded event and there's a progress event. Those are the things we have to listen to.
So the .done would run after the load.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So we call Ajax here, and then after this closing parentheses, here is where I put .done or .fail. That's all the way at the end after all of this. And yeah, so that would run after load. Okay. So you were asking about Bootstrap progress bar. Good segue. So the Bootstrap progress bar looks a little bit like this. The structure as far as building up the HTML, you can definitely look at the Bootstrap guide, because there's a lot more to it than what I'm going to talk about here, including some animated bars and different things like that. So there's a lot you can do with it. But here's a good kind of starting point. So as far as setting it up, we've got two divs here. So first, the outer div is sort of our container. And then inside of that, we've got what's going to actually be our progress bar. So if you're looking at the screenshot here, this whole area, I don't know if you can see it, but it would be grayed out. That whole area is the progress. And then inside this part that's shaded is the progress bar. That's the inner div. So what's happening is as the progress goes on, this inner div changes size. That's how we make it work. So 2 classes, Bootstrap classes, to make sure this works. You have to make sure you have progress here and progress dash bar on the inner one. That's the important thing to make Bootstrap happen. You can also specify the height of the progress bar here. You're going to put that on the container. You can change the color of the progress bar. So here I said BG success, which is going to make it green. If I wanted to make it red, I'd say like BG danger, or if you wanted to make it blue, I think it's BG info. So you just change the background color of that bar, and that will change the color of the bar. Inside here, you'll see I have style width 0. That's what we're going to be manipulating from code. That's what you manipulate from code to make it change size. Okay, so you manipulate the style width %0. Okay, so if we want to be 50% done, we're going to set that to 50% width. Okay, and again, that works because it's inside of this container, right? So it's 50% of the width of the progress bar. I also need to put in this roll progress bar. That's for accessibility for screen readers. Anytime you put in that roll, that's what that's about. So we're telling that this div should be treated as a progress bar, because otherwise screen readers just know it's a div. Okay. Similar thing here, this ARIA, value now, value min, value max, all 3 of those are for accessibility purposes. Does that make sense? So this is the current value, this is the minimum value, and that is the maximum value. So it's currently 0, it goes from 0 to max. Inside of that inner div, I can also put some text, which is what's going to show up on top of the progress bar. So if I want to say it's 50% complete, I'm going to write in here 50% complete. So the things that we need to change as it's kind of going on, I think my colors are actually on the wrong area. So the 3 things we want to change from code is the width of the bar, this value now, and the text inside of there. That make sense? Those are the 3 things that are going to make the progress bar change dynamically. Okay. So let me go back to VS Code, and we can look at the example progress bar that I've gotten built here. Index, let me turn that on. And put in my, okay, file save. So just with the HTML, so far here we've got it 0% uploaded, okay? I'm going to add in some JavaScript, and we'll see what that does, and then I'll kind of explain how that works. So save. And you can see when the page loads, it starts at 0% and just starts sliding over until we get to 100%. I haven't made it stop, so it keeps going. Huh? Yeah. So in the real world, you might do that. It won't actually matter, because the stopping at 100% won't actually matter, because as soon as you mix it in with those progress events, you're not going to get a progress event that's higher than 100%. So that's not really relevant for the problem at hand. So let's look at the JavaScript code that's making this happen. Okay. So first thing I have is I've got a variable here that I'm starting at 0, and then I've got set interval here, and set interval every 1/10 of a second. So every 1/10 of a second, it's going to update the progress bar. So, and you can see ++%. So every 1/10 of a second, I'm adding a % to it. That makes sense? Again, this % variable would be calculated from Ajax if you were using Ajax. Okay, and you kind of saw how that works. So this is the code that actually updates the bar. So we've got %string, which I'm going to say, take the %, call toFixed on that. Again, toFixed is going to say, round that to an integer, and round it, I'm saying 2 fix 0, so it's going to round it to an integer, round it so it's only got, so it's got 0 decimal places. I need that for a few things that I want to do next, right? So I'm going to round it to 0 decimal places. I'm going to grab the progress bar. Progress bar, I've got an ID of my progress bar. That's on the container, you can see here. So I'm saying grab the container, and then inside of that, I want the progress bar child. And I should actually do that as a direct descendant. So grab the direct descendant that has the class progress bar, and then I'm going to set 3 things on it. So I'm going to use CSS. CSS allows me to change that style property. So remember that style property up here says width 0. So I'm going to change that width property to %string plus %. So that's going to be 2%, 3%, 4%. That's what actually changes the width of the bar. Okay. Next thing I'm doing is I'm calling ATTR. ATTR allows me to change the value of an attribute. Okay. So this changes the value of a CSS, and this changes the value of the attribute. So I'm saying ARIA value now is now this. Again, that's for screen readers. And then finally, I'm saying HTML %string plus %uploaded. And that's going to change the text that shows up over the bar, over the progress. Any questions there? Looks relatively simple. So if you kind of think about, you can combine that bit of code as updating the progress bar, assuming you know your percentage. That's how you display that percentage.
So the event loaded.
Yep. So the event that loaded, you just could set it to 100% and maybe change the message to something to say, hey, we're importing it now. Versus if you were looking at up here, see we've got the % calculated here. We would just go upload the progress bar.
Right. Okay.
Does that make sense? You can kind of combine those 2 pieces.
So is the idea like if we're like, so if we're like doing like a CRUD operation on a variable, or like for example, if we're uploading an image to
Yep.
our resume, is the idea is to like, would it be to like, you're uploading it and you wait, once you hit that 100%, like re-enable like the actual submit of the entire CRUD operation?
You could. More than likely you wouldn't though until you hit done or fail. When you hit done or fail is when you would want to re-enable the button if you've disabled it.
Right.
You wouldn't want to enable it before done or fail, because at that point it's still, the server's still working. Once loaded is fired. But you can use that to make the progress bar animate. So you might say, hey, I'm uploading my portfolio image. So you have a progress bar underneath that, upload, you hit save, disables the button, and that would kind of show the progress bar going until you're done. So you can kind of see, oh, it's working on uploading my file. Okay. Or for instance, if we want to upload a spreadsheet, we can put a progress bar in there and say, you know, maybe that spreadsheet is several megabytes in size. It might take some time for that to upload. So we can give the user some indication of how far along that is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
So that using Ajax in this way with a Bootstrap progress bar gives us a way to show the user how is it actually doing anything, or is it just like hung? I didn't click save or whatnot. So that gives the user a way to see that it's working. Okay. So back on the back end, we have talked about uploading images, and we talked about more generally uploading any type of file. But there are some special constraints that we may want to do, special things that we may want to do with images. So as far as C# is, well, ASP.NET's concerned, there's a class called WebImage, and WebImage allows us to do a few things with images. Okay. So we can say new WebImage, give it an input string, which we can get from the HTTP posted file base. That will give us a way to read it. What this does actually is it'll go read that file, and then we can actually work with it and know how big it is. So if I'm just working with HTTP posted file base, I can't know how big or small the image is. I don't know its width, I don't know its height. I can tell how many bytes it is, right? So I can tell just by looking at HTTP hosted file base, you can't actually see the file size. So I can say, oh, this is bigger than 4 megabytes, you can't upload this, right? I can do that. But if I want to say that your image has to be smaller than a certain size, or bigger than a certain size, for you to be allowed to upload it, I need to actually know that it's an image and be able to work with the width and the height. Does that make sense? So as soon as I say web image, new web image, give it the input stream, I can now access the width and the height properties. That will tell me how big it is. So I can use that for validation to say, okay, you can't upload a file bigger than this or smaller than that. But I also can use that to resize the image. So image has a method called resize, and what I give it is 2 numbers. So one is a width and one is a height, and it will resize it to fit in that box. And it'll actually preserve the aspect ratios, in fact. So if it's a 16 by 9 image and I sell it to scale to 128 by 128, it's still going to keep that 16 by 9 aspect ratio, but fit it in so that it fits in that 128 by 128 box. So we can just say image resize. That'll, if the user gives me an image that's too big, where I'm saying here it's bigger than the maximum width and bigger than the maximum height, either of those things are true, scale it down. So if they give me a 4K image and I say I only want something that's 1,000 pixels wide at most, well, I can scale that in, and then I don't have to save the whole image.
In Microsoft Docs, it also says it takes 2 booleans after, or
For resize?
yeah, resize. It'll say there are 2 ints and then 2 booleans.
I'd have to look about it, but those aren't. This is usually enough to make what you. Leaving the booleans alone is usually enough to get it to do what you need it to do. For our purposes, that will be enough. So we can scale it down with resize, and then we can also call save. So image.save, we give it a path name, that'll save it to disk. So here I'm saying, okay, resize it down to my upper limit. Yep.
It just says it's for preserve aspect ratio and prevent enlarge.
And prevent what?
Enlarge.
Okay.
Just like optional, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think by default it's set to preserve aspect ratio, and by default the prevent enlarge is also false. So it would potentially enlarge it, and it's going to preserve the aspect ratio for us. This is what it's fine. So effectively what I'm telling it to do, by default it's preserving the aspect ratio, which is what I want. Here I've already checked, and I've said that is it greater than my max width, greater than my max height? So this check here is actually going to prevent it from enlarging it. That makes sense. So if my limit was 1,000 by 1,000 and you give me an image that's 200 by 200, this if will actually prevent it from being enlarged. So that's the other way you can go about doing it. And that gives you a little bit more control over it. So there I'm saying don't grow it if it's already within my bounds. Okay. The next thing I'm doing is I'm saving a thumbnail. So I've saved the image. I can also then go save a thumbnail, because frequently I may want a small version of the image, maybe on the search page, and then a full image on your actual profile page or wherever. Does that make sense? Or if you're looking at the product details page, you want the full image, versus the product list, you only want a small thumbnail. Okay? So I can save the image, and then I can use this to save a thumbnail. So here I'm saying resize it down to my thumbnail size. So this might be 128, 128, 64, 64, 256, 256, whatever you want to use for your thumbnail. Just make that a constant, and you can say, okay, resize it to fit in that box, and then save it. Now when I save it, you see I'm saying destination folder, what folder you want to save it, plus the file name. Here I'm adding in another step. So this is going to save it into, let's say this is my product images. I'm saving it to the product image folders. This would be product images / thumbnails / my little pony.png. You got a hand up?
No.
Okay. Does that make sense? So I'm saving the thumbnails into a thumbnails folder. That way I have both of those. And they have the same file name. And by them having the same file name, that makes it very easily accessible. If I'm just saving to the database, I'm saving just the file name. It makes it very easy to go find the thumbnail.
So just in practice, so let's say, go back to like the resume constructor thing, we have like a, like an image URL associated with a resume, rather than having, you know, MIME type, all that stuff. We just have the URL,
Yeah, you just have the name of the file,
and that way we can easily access.
both the thumbnail
And
and the full image. So you say, okay, it's resume images. We'll save it to the resume images folder, and then we'll just save the name of the file in the database. That's all I need.
Cool.
Now, I could potentially change the name of the file. I don't need to necessarily keep the same file that the user gave me, and that's often better, is if you generate a random file name, anytime the user gives you something, you usually want to generate a random file name and discard the one they gave you. Because otherwise, if I upload resume.pdf and you upload resume.pdf, well, they're going to override each other. I'm going to lose one. Whoever uploaded first, I'm going to lose their resume, and we're going to have a second one. So oftentimes it's best to generate a new name, and usually based on the ID of the resume or the ID, just a randomly generated ID. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, but that's how that works. So you can see, using that code, now we can save thumbnails, we can save the image, we can scale things down. Because previously, if you wanted to put an image in there, and it was too big, what did we have to do? We had to go to Photoshop, scale it down, or go to the Photos app and just scale it down. So that way we can just scale it down in code. Our users don't have to know how to do that, right? Or we can tell them, hey, it's too big, you need to go scale it down. Or give me a better image if it's too small. Okay, so that's as far as images go. And we've talked about the front end, we've talked about HTML, we've talked about the JavaScript, we've talked about the CSS. We've talked a little bit about the back end as well. Okay, let's go take a break and come back at 3:15, and when we'll hit the last piece of this for today. Yeah, you can see here, you see in the documentation, Scott, see it says equals true, so that's the default.
Oh, okay.
So if I don't pass those arguments, it will by default be true and false.
I was just, yeah, there's some pretty cool stuff
Yeah.
on there that potentially you could,
Yeah.
like further down, doing all that, you know, you can flip or,
Mhm.
add
So yeah, flip
text.
horizontal, flip vertical, you've got rotate left and right, you've got a crop in there as well, so crop would say I only want to keep part of the image. Yeah, so all of those kind of things it can do.
Pretty
when you're working with images, which is really, really helpful. Oh, you're, this is a Bootstrap, right? And the CSS that you put in, get rid of that. Because remember, we changed that to style the, that's when we were just doing plain, we were just doing stuff without Bootstrap.
Oh, right, right. Okay.
See, that's what was causing all that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought I missed it.
So here you do it if you're just doing plain, you're not using Bootstrap. Right? Here, see, I kind of underlined things to kind of show you about it. And then, okay, hey, let's start with Bootstrap. Bootstrap makes it easier.
Right. That's pretty cool.
But there may be times where you need to get into the nitty-gritty and deal with the CSS because Bootstrap not doing what you want. So, or if you're using Angular, I've heard that Angular likes to use something other than Bootstrap.
Oh, really?
Forces you into something else. So. Refreshing on your stuff we learned from this summer.
Yeah, I'm kind of trying to remember all that initial, well, the Ajax stuff and the JavaScript stuff.
And CSS.
The CSS, yeah, that's like a blast. Even though it was just over the summer, it's 5 months later, it's like, yeah, catch up on that.
Just kind of every once in a while, like,
We haven't used CSS in a while. Yeah, you haven't used CSS in a while. It's like, oh yeah, it actually is important to doing all this stuff. You actually do it.
yeah, there are times when you need it.
off to a bad start because me and this girl work on Sunday together, and she's my, like for Sunday rush, and she's a big help to me. But he fired her last week for seemingly no real good reason. But either way, I wasn't really mad that he fired her, but I was like, who's gonna cover her shit?
Yeah.
He's like, all right, I'll come in, I got you. He never showed up.
Are you serious?
Yeah, so I worked last Sunday by myself, like the whole shift. So like me and him, already off to that start. But anyway, he had like this sheet in the back of the office that was basically like a thing that all the employees have to sign, and it's about like drug use at work. And like it's like no drug use, no talking about drug this and all this hardcore stuff, and I'm like,
You can't even talk about who you want to talk about.
yeah, I'm like, who's he talking about, you know? But then he just texted me and asked me if I could find him for some stuff. I'm like, what? I'm like, first of all, like, I don't know why you.
Where did he come from?
Huh?
Where did he come from?
He seems pretty legit. Like he's got experience as far as since he got hired. There's been like a bunch of things have been organized. Like things do look a lot better since he started working. I don't know exactly what he's a little bit older than me. He's about 35, 36. Got experience, but kind of not starting off too well. He's a little shady.
It always kind of, I don't want to say like, I don't know, it doesn't bug me, but like, where I've been working, I've been working there for like 8 years. So whenever like a new boss or someone comes in, or a new manager comes in, tries to shake a bunch of stuff up, or does something, it's like, I've been here for so long. Like, I know how the owner wants it done, so you don't gotta come to me and be like, you need to do like this. This is like, trust me, I know exactly what I need.
Yeah.
Like there's this, in the restaurant industry though, there's a lot of turnover, so I see it a lot. Like there's this one lady, she started working there as a server and I trained her. So, and then like it came out weeks later that she was gonna be a manager. I'm like, oh, okay, that's funny. And then she kept like wanting to change like these tiny little things, like maybe the pepper grinder should be here instead of there. It's like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And so she didn't last very long.
No.
She did not last very long, dude.
That's because I've been there 2 years, so like I know how the kitchen needs to be more or less ran, but this guy was kind of trying to do some new stuff. And it's like, like, dude, I've been here for a while now.
Some people just want to make like an impact, but where I work, like the owner is very specific in how he likes things done. So whenever the manager tries to like freelance some stuff, he's like, it's like some people are fine with that. They just want the manager role to just like for the pay, and some people are like, I want to make a difference. It's like,
Yeah. I mean, I'll admit some of the stuff he is being helpful, but some of the other stuff I'm kind of like, dude, like, people have tried and failed before you.
Right.
It's like some of that stuff's just probably not gonna fly.
Do you see your owner fairly often, or are they not very often?
I see the one. There's a couple others.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But the main, from what I could tell, Colleen. Yeah, I see her pretty good.
You see her pretty often?
Yeah. I think she's awesome.
Yeah, that's good. At least there's always someone you can talk to. Like,
See, I don't know what's going on. It's like her and her husband own it, but he's always sitting at the bar.
he's just there to hang out.
She's busting ass.
He's like,
you always just see him.
He's like one of those owners. If you ever watch Bar Rescue?
Oh, I love it.
Those owners just like,
This is a good idea, please. Yeah, that one has been since first semester.
I love that show probably more than like Gordon Ramsay. That guy cracks me up.
that guy cracks me up too.
Yeah, like Capper. Yeah.
So we talked about the HTML, we talked about using some CSS to style it, we talked about using JavaScript for Ajax and for a progress bar, and we talked a little bit about the resizing images on the back end. The next thing I want to talk about is how do we deal with spreadsheets, because more often than not, your users will have a lot of data that they want imported, and they're going to have it in a spreadsheet. More than likely, it's going to be an Excel spreadsheet. And rather than having them import data line by line, doing a lot of data entry, we want to have them be able to just upload a spreadsheet, and it puts the data in the database. So A lot of the tools that we've talked about are already relevant to that because you're uploading a file. And most of the stuff, with the exception of this little part that we talked about, resizing images, all that applies regardless of what kind of file you're working with. Okay, so to work specifically with spreadsheets, we do need to bring in another NuGet package to deal with that. Microsoft does have some tools to work with Excel spreadsheets. My experience with them is they have a lot of issues, and including one important issue is that they require you to have actually Excel installed on your server. So this NuGet package doesn't require you to do that. You don't have to have Excel installed to use it on the server. So it's called Excel Data Reader, and it can read XSLX files, it can read the older XLS files, and it also reads CSV files. And all read them in the same format. What you end up getting out of this is it gives you a data set, and which is part of the old ADO framework, which is what we used to use for databases, kind of predates Entity Framework. But that's what we get, and that's what we then have to deal with this. The upside of that is there are a lot of tools to work with ADO, and it's been around for a while, so it's pretty mature. So that's helpful. Okay. So what I have here, the first step is we need to take the file, read it from disk, and then we can start working with it in memory. One thing to note here, in order for this to work, we do, unlike with the images you saw up here, we can get it as an HTTP posted file base, we're saving it here. Okay, so we're resizing it in memory, and then the first time that we save it is actually here. First time we save it to disk. Here we actually have to save it to disk before we can follow this function. Because in order to deal with reading it in, we unfortunately can't easily read it in. Well, I take that back, but we generally, with spreadsheets, we want to save them first before we do any of the importing process. So we're going to save it to disk, and then we're going to tell it what's the path to the file. So this path here needs to be a physical path. It needs to be not a virtual path, but where it is physically, where you've saved it. There's also Boolean here for checking whether or not there's a header row. So typically your spreadsheets, that top row will tell you what the names of the columns are. So if you set that to true, you assume that that's there. Otherwise, it's going to assume that if you set that to false, then you're saying that your first row of data is going to be data, right, and not the names of the columns. So first thing we need to know is to figure out how we can create the reader. So with this NuGet package, there's a class called Excel Reader Factory. That's what actually creates the reader to read it from disk. And there's two methods on there. So one is create reader. Create reader gives us one that can read an Excel file, and there's create CSV reader will give us something that will read a CSV file. Okay, so we want to say if the extension is XSLS, XLS, or XSLSX, either of those, if it's an Excel spreadsheet, we're going to use the Excel reader. If it's a CSV file, we're going to read with the CSV reader. Okay, and then if it's anything else, I'm just throwing an exception. Say it's not valid. Try again. Try something else. Okay. Next thing, now that we've figured out which reader we're going to use, we've created a function here effectively. You can kind of see the lambda. So it takes a stream, and it gives us this iExcel data reader object. Okay, so we need to now open the file. So to open the file, I'm going to use file.open. This off. There it is. And batteries on that are dead. So I'm going to use file.open. I need to give it the path name, and then I've got a few different flags. So first one says that I just want to open the file. There's already a file there. I'm not going to read it. I'm not going to write to it. I don't want you to create a file. Just open the file if it's there. If there's no file there, then throw me exception. I'm opening it to read it and only to read it. I don't care about writing it. I'm only reading it. And then the third thing is to say, well, anybody else can read it. Nobody else can write it while I'm working with it, but anybody else can read it. Does that make sense? If you don't set that, then nobody else can touch the file while you're in the middle of using it. So that's a just general good housekeeping. Leave it open for people. So we create the stream, and then we create the reader to actually go read the data. Now, one thing you'll notice here, I have two using statements. So I have using block here, using block there. Okay. Remember we were talking about finally the other day. So this version of using kind of works like a finally. It guarantees that the file gets close. If I don't put that using around there, then there may be cases where the file doesn't get closed. So this is a little bit cleaner, a little bit easier than implementing it with finally, even though you can implement it with finally still. So I'm going to say if open up the stream, and then if anything goes wrong in here or we get to the end of this, that's where it's going to close the stream. Similar here, open the reader, close the reader. That's what that's about. Okay. So in here, I'm also saying I need to give it some configuration. The configuration that I'm giving it to read the data set, I'm just telling it, hey, do you have a header row or not? So again, if you have a header row, then the first row of the spreadsheet contains the column names. So reader.asDataset, and then I just return this data set. So at that point, I have this data set object. Okay? All clear? Go review that here furthermore, but that's the basic setup of reading it from the disk and into memory. Okay? So the rough outline as far as getting files to actually be imported. There's more details to this typically because you're going to check if the file is too big or too small, or does it fit your schema. So there's a lot more details that you probably want to do for validation check or to make sure they haven't left columns blank or fields blank. But this is the rough idea. So first we're going to install that NuGet package, the Excel data reader package. We're going to load it into a data set using this code. That's going to take care of getting it into a data set. And then what we need to do is create some sort of view model class. We need to create a class that represents each row of that spreadsheet. Because what we're going to do is we're first going to load it from the data set into a list of those objects. And then that list of objects we're then going to actually transfer over to the database. Doing that interim makes things a lot easier rather than dealing with the data set the whole time.
So an anonymous object not work on that?
No, you typically need to have a defined object there. You could, in some cases, use an anonymous, but the upside that you really do want to use a named object here, because the idea is you're taking the spreadsheet, which may be in a bunch of different ways. You know, users might have formatted their columns in different orders and things like that, so you may need to deal with things like that into a more standardized format. So that's where we want to use a class in between and not use an anonymous object. Does that make sense? Because the whole point is that interim, we want to get to a strictly typed sort of step. Because that'll help making sure the data is valid as well as making the next steps easier. So we created it, we put it into some sort of view model object for each row. We're going to generally put those into a list, so we'll iterate through the data set and do that transformation. Once we've done that transformation, once we've got that list or sequence of view model objects, those we'll then use to populate the database. That's kind of the rough order of steps. Okay, does that make sense? So we start with load the spreadsheet into the data set, take the data set, turn it into a list of objects, and then turn that list of objects into data that we can put into the database. Okay, so when we're working with data sets, there's a few different properties and such that we need to, accessors that we need to know about. So first of all, on the data set, there is a tables property. and that gives us the tabs that we have in our spreadsheet. So a CSV can only ever have one tab, but an Excel spreadsheet, remember, you can have as many tabs as you want. So tables gives us that list of tabs. So each table is a single tab. Make sense? Table is a single tab. So tables.count will tell us how many of them there are, how many tabs your spreadsheet has. Generally, we want that to be 1 for most cases. And then we're going to say table 0, that would be the first tab. Or table 1 would be the second tab. Table 2 would be the third. Make sense? So we can treat it, it's basically an array. Similar thing here. Once I've got the table, there's a few different properties on the table. So I can say table.columns.count, that gives me how many columns. Table.rows.count will tell me how many rows are in there. Again, that would be excluding the header row. If I say table columns 0, that'd be the first column. Table rows 0, that would be the first row. I can also get the column name, assuming I have that header row. I can say table.column name, column 0, column name, column 1, column name, etc. So that gives me the text that you have in the column name. Make sense? Questions? And then finally, I may want to get the data in the individual rows. To get the data in the individual rows, you're going to refer to it like so. You're going to say table.rows, so I and J. So I gives you which row, up and down, and then J, that second index, is going to tell you which column are you looking at. And then we need to say toString. So toString is going to take that object that's there, turn it into a string, and then we can deal with it as need be, just because there's some quirky types that usually come up when you're pulling it from a spreadsheet. Okay, any questions on that? Does that make sense? Okay, so let's delve into some code here. So here's an example of what this might look like. So assuming I've loaded the data already, assuming I've saved it on my server, I've loaded it now into a data set, I need to create this view model to import the data. So in this case, I'm importing some basic just customer information. So in this case, my spreadsheet is going to have 3 columns, a first name, a last name, and an email. That's all I'm having in my spreadsheet. Okay? So, and I'm also tracking what row number each of these rows is. So I'm saying, here's my imported customer object. This is kind of what I was talking about, my view model. This is what I'm going to load it into temporarily, and it reflects the structure of the spreadsheet. Does that make sense? And this is where I'm strictly typing it. You can see where this is different than an anonymous object, because I'm trying to just say, define what the structure of the database is, of the spreadsheet is. Okay? So the first thing I want to do here, I'm going to say, check how many tabs does it have? Because more than likely, if they have more than one tab, well, then they're probably accidentally put the data on the wrong tab. It might not be on the first tab. So I want to say, well, let's just check that there's only one tab. So I'm going to say, if it's not 0, if it's not 1, let's throw an exception. Say, we'll stop right here. It's a common thing you may want to do is check that things are exactly as you'd expect them to be. So I'm going to say, if there's more than one tab, we're done. Get out of here. We only want one tab. Assuming there is one tab now, I'm going to then go grab that first tab. So I'm going to go save, I'm going to say dataset.table0. I'm going to save that to a variable so I can use that for the rest of this method. That make sense? At this point, I'm done with the data set. I'm just working with that single table. Okay. Next thing I want to do is I want to make sure that the columns are right. So if there's not exactly 3 columns, we're done. If the first column isn't first name, or second column isn't last name, third column isn't email, we're done. So we're being very strict about what the format of this is. You don't necessarily have to be this strict in the real world, but generally being pretty strict will end up giving you better data. Does that make sense? And giving the user meaningful error messages is also a really good thing, because they'll need those to figure out what's wrong. So that's where I'm saying expected one sheet, found blah blah blah. So I wanted only wanted one sheet. Okay, so that's just basic validation. We're just saying, does the spreadsheet fit my structure, fit my template? Okay. The next thing, my next step is I'm going to take that data set and now I'm going to start loading it into that list of imported customer objects. So I'm going to create a list here, new list, imported customer. I'm going to grab this row number counter here too. This is going to be row number 1. So I'm tracking which row am I on. So I'm starting at 1 because as far as Excel is concerned, right? Remember the first row in Excel is 1. It's not 0. Okay. Then I'm going to loop through. So for each row in the table, I'm going to loop through and I'm going to process it. Note that I'm doing a plus plus row number first. Okay. Now the reason I'm doing it first is because I'm assuming I had a header row, which then the header row is not actually data. That's row 1. So the first row of actual data is row 2. Does that make sense? That's why I'm doing the plus plus first. If you didn't have a header row, then you want to do the row number down here at the end. Increment the row number. But because I have a header row, I'm going to go ahead and increment it first. Okay. Now I'm going to build a customer object, put in the row number, grab in, well, row 0, we know that that's that first column. Row 1, second column, row 2 is the third column. I'm going to say toString and trim. Trim's another good step in there because I want to remove the white space on the beginning and end of that data. Make sense? So if they have extra white space at the beginning or the end, typically we don't care about that. So once I'm done with this, add that object to the imported customer list. So at this point, I have a list of imported customers. Does that make sense? So at that point, we can work with it. We're out of needing to deal with the data set anymore. Does that make sense? So that way I can kind of separate the part that works with the data set with the part from the part that works with the database. Right? So here's the part that works with the spreadsheet and gets it into a list of objects. And then here's the part that takes the list of objects and turns it into the row structure, the table structure. Make sense? You usually want to keep those two parts separated, and that's what that helps with. Now, the next thing I need to do is I want to actually get these customers into the database. And the naive approach would be to just say, oh, we'll just take all the rows and we'll add them to the customers table. What's the problem there?
Is there a potential for duplicate data?
Exactly, right? So if I'm not checking, I'm more than likely importing the customer twice. And if I don't have unique constraints on my database, that just means, well, okay, now I have extra rows I have 2 copies of John Smith with the same email in my table. And let's say the user imports that spreadsheet 3 times. Well, now they've got 3 copies of that same person. Not a good thing, right? So we do need to do some checking for duplication. I do for sure want to have some unique constraints on the database as well. But if I do have those unique constraints, that's actually then going to give me an exception when I go to upload the spreadsheet the second time. Because it's going to say, oh, I can't do that because it's already there. But oftentimes what happens is when you're uploading a spreadsheet, you're going to have some data that's in the database and some data that isn't. That makes sense? So if you have a big spreadsheet of customers or a big spreadsheet of products, it's more than likely that some of those products are in the database and some of those aren't. So we need to distinguish between that. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go and try to find all the existing customers. So given the customers that are in the spreadsheet, let me go find all of those that are already in the database. So I'm going to say from C and customers, join that with my list of imported customers, and we're going to join that on the first name, the last name, and the email address. So we're going to say join on c.first last email, and then that equals first last and email. So I'm joining those together. So if there's any customers in the database with the same first, last, and email, now I have those. That make sense? That's how I'm getting those. And then that'll end up being in a list. So I'm saying select C, so I'm keeping just the customer objects. Okay, questions?
So you're only selecting the customers that are the same as what you have.
Right. Right. So only the customers that, like, they're in the spreadsheet and they're in the database. Scott,
I don't know.
you're grimacing. It makes me think you have a question.
No, I wish I could say it like in some sort of action. I don't know.
Okay.
It's a lot of information.
Huh?
It's a lot of information.
Okay. Yeah.
I see both not.
So that's my goal, is I'm trying to find out all the customers that are already there. Okay, so this is going to give me a list of customers that's already there. The next thing I want to do is, now that I know the customers that are already there, let's figure out which customers are new. Okay, so I'm also going to use a join to do that. But I'm going to do the join differently. Okay, so here I joined from the customer, from the database, right? And I join that with the imported customers. Okay. What I'm doing down here is a little bit different. So I'm starting with the imported customers and joining that to the existing customers. Okay. And this looks pretty much the same. So I'm saying, oh, this should actually be, I do have the wrong code here. This should be I, and this should be E. There. So I'm joining from imported to existing, and then I'm writing this here. So I'm saying into G. Okay. That effectively is a left join in link. So by putting here I have an inner join. This is a left join.
So what that does is it basically just eliminates all the duplicates when you're doing the left join.
So not exactly. So when I'm doing the left join, I'm still keeping the duplicates. That's not what takes care of it. What I'm doing is I'm matching up the imported with anybody that is existing. Okay. Now, what this does is then for every imported customer, I get this variable G. Variable G contains all of the customers, all of the existing customers with the same first name, last name, and email. It contains all of the customers that match. That make sense? And there's a G for every single imported customer. That makes sense? This is not just one there. I call it G for short for group. That's why I'm using that letter. So short for group. So I get a group of all the related, all the existing customers to go with the imported customer. What actually eliminates the duplicates is the next line down here. So I say where G.any. G.any says, are there any things, is there any records in G, in this group? Does this group contain anything? If this group contains anything, then I don't care about that customer, because they already exist. So this line right here is what's eliminating the duplicates. So this is just mapping them up. This is what actually eliminates them, is the where clause. So if there are any existing customers that match up with the imported, then I know that that customer is already existing. I don't want them. I only want the people that are new.
So why don't you select G instead of I?
No, because I want the list of imported customer objects. If I did select G, remember I'm only picking ones that are empty. So if I selected G, I would just be getting a bunch of empty things.
So the new imported customers won't have any duplicates at that point?
Right. So new customers, which I'm creating here, so new customers no longer has the duplicates, no longer contains the existing customers. That makes sense? I've eliminated the existing customers from my list. So imported customers is everybody that's in the spreadsheet. Existing customers, everybody that's in the database. And then this is the new customers, the people that are new. They're in the spreadsheet, not in the database.
So on the new customers, you don't have the two lists, but on the existing customers, you have two lists. Why is that?
Yeah, so here I needed to run two lists because it's against the database.
Okay.
So I needed to materialize that. If I didn't run that, then this would be trying to run in SQL. I want this to run in C#. That makes sense? This is logic here I need to run in C#, whereas this is logic I need to run in SQL. That's the difference. And then when I go down here, I could say two lists on here. The trick is I don't really need to, because the next thing I'm going to do with it is I'm going to just say AWD customers.addRange new customers. If I was going to do anything more with this list of new customers, then I would materialize to a list. But because this is the last use I'm using of it, I don't want to waste that menu in an application. So if I was importing more in here, so like if I was importing orders, and I had order and customer information in the spreadsheet, then I would probably say two list on that.
What is the new doing? Like the on new and equals new?
There. Okay.
Right.
So here I'm creating an anonymous object. This says create an anonymous object with 3 properties on it.
Oh, okay.
That's needed because I'm joining on more than one column. If I was just joining on email, I would just say on i.email, on equals e.email. But the new curly brace thing is there because I'm joining on 3 columns instead of 1.
I just want to talk through this one more time,
Yeah.
what's actually happening here. So we get the existing customers, which are what, I understand that part.
Yeah.
It's so, and then we join them again on that same, on those 3 columns.
Yeah.
And we're putting them into what is effectively a group.
Yes. So we're getting a group per row in the spreadsheet.
Per row in the spreadsheet. Oh, I think that's where my confusion is. Oh, okay, so we're getting a group per row in the spreadsheet.
Assuming that there's only ever one customer in the database with the same first name, last name, email, this group will always either only have no things or one thing. It will either have nothing in it, which means that user doesn't exist yet, or it will have one row, which is the row that already exists in the database.
Okay, and then the where is just
Throw away anybody
throw
that
away
has
anything that
has an associated row.
and that's taking it out of the, so and then we're reselecting the imported customers again, but that imported customers has been modified through that where
So
clause.
this is not, new customers is not imported customers. These are 2 separate lists.
Oh, we're just selecting, okay, yeah, I
Select the I.
right.
Select that object.
When
So
you
I'm
say
trying to think
into
about-
G, are you just creating a new list on the
Yeah.
side? Okay.
Yeah, G is a list. Think of G as a list of customer objects.
So is it taking the second ones where the I and E match and putting
Yep.
them into G,
And putting them into G
right?
Yep.
And then the where,
eliminates anyone where G isn't empty.
so that takes them out of I somehow?
That
Can we,
takes them out of new customers.
Can we draw this out, how it would look visually?
Okay. Maybe.
I think, at least, I don't
So
know.
yeah, it's taking from I and putting it into a new variable.
Okay, so let's say we've got the spreadsheet here.
Match.
And we've got the database over here. And here I have John Smith and John Doe. Okay, over in the database, I have John Doe and Mary Mag or something. Give me a shorter name.
Mary Sue.
Mary Sue.
That's the first thing.
There we go. Mary Sue.
Let's give the hardest last
I don't know why it's first name on
So let's say we're starting with this, right? So here's what's in the spreadsheet, there's what's in the database, okay? So the first step here is we built up this list, right? I built up the important customers. So important customers contains these two people, right? The next thing I'm doing is I'm building the list of existing customers, okay? So existing well, existing matches up people that are in both places, right? So we've got John Doe in both places. So existing is only going to take John Doe, because he's the only person that's in both places, right? If I had more people that matched, all those people would be here, okay? The next thing I want to do is I want to figure out which people that are here but not there, right? So specifically here but not there, okay? So as I'm building up the new list, okay, so I'm going to go through imported customers. So first I have John Smith. I'm trying to join John Smith with the list of existing customers. Is there anybody in the existing customer list that matches up with him? No. So I'm just going to match him up with an empty G. G's going to be empty for him. Okay. Now John Doe, is there anybody in the existing list that he matches up with?
Yes.
He matches up with himself. So he matches up with John Doe. Okay. So what I have over here is I. What I have over here is G. Okay. So what I'm saying is, give me only the ones where this is empty, where G is empty, right? So I'm going to keep John Smith, but my where is going to filter out John Doe.
So when there's not a match, G is effectively null.
G is an empty list.
Okay.
G is an empty list.
Yeah. Okay. And that's why the any filters it out, because it doesn't.
Correct. G says, so any says, is there any records in this list? Is the count greater than 0?
Yeah.
So we're saying, is there any records? If there's any, and then not that, because there's a not at the beginning. So I say, there is one here, so any is true, here any is false.
Who ends up in I by the end?
So again, starting with this, so we have I in both of these. So here's I and here's I, here's G and here's G, right? My where eliminated that row from the results. So when I get down to select, I have an I and I have a G, but the only records I have left is these ones that didn't match up, right? So I do have, this is an I, that's an I, this one isn't in the result set though, because of the where. It doesn't make it past, this row doesn't make it past the where. So the select is just what's left over after the where.
Now I see the left join. That makes way more sense. Okay.
Right. So there's a left join and then this where, this is what we call a subtraction. Okay. So if you're thinking about sets, let's go back to our good old Venn diagrams. So we've got the spreadsheet and the database, right? So this area here is the spreadsheet, that area is the database. This intersection here, that's the existing customers, right? The new customers, where do they live? So this is existing. The new customers live over here. So what I'm trying to get is just that section that's over here but not in the overlap. And getting that section, that's what we call a subtraction. So if you're thinking about this in terms of set theory, which you might have learned in math, effectively the way we would describe that is we would say SS minus DB. That's how we would write that in if we were dealing with graph. But it takes quite a bit more code to actually implement a subtraction, unfortunately, than just saying minus. I wish it was easier.
Venn diagram visualization helps a lot.
So that's the goal of all that, is we need to do a subtraction. So once I've got that, I just say add range and save changes, and now all our customers are in the database. But we don't have any duplicates. Questions?
John Smith
Mm-hmm.
is the new customer.
Is the only new customer. Yeah. So in this case, the only person that's over here in the spreadsheet that's not over there is John Smith. So John Smith's the only person that's going to end up in the database.
Since John Doe is an existing customer already,
Uh-huh.
he would already be in the database.
Right. He already is there.
So that's our
So I'm not doing anything with him.
Right.
Per this code, I'm not doing anything with him. In a real world scenario, it might be that there's some additional data
Mhm.
in that spreadsheet that I might want to update. Right? So maybe I have an age in here and maybe I want to update John Doe's age.
Mhm.
So I might still change that over here. But all I'm doing is just inserting new rows right now.
So, okay, so right now John Doe is in G and going away because he's already in the database.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. This is one G. This is one G that goes with that I, and then this is the G that goes with that I. You kind of think about these, anytime you were working with these link queries, think of them as a for loop. So all these variables that I got here, I, E, and G, these are one iteration of the loop. So every iteration of the loop, they're going to have a different value. That's really all I have for today. There's more to it than that. As far as when you get into the nitty-gritty to it, but that's kind of a simple example of how it's going to work out. So I posted up the labs, I haven't posted up the homework yet, so you should be able to get started on that. As you have questions, just ask me.